Trio of Evolution Committee. Our goal is to facilitate access to science and accurate information to surface scientific thinking, hereby to contribute to the scientific enlightenment, which is our common dream, as we can. To achieve this goal, we especially focus on subjects that are neither taught nor spoken and seen as taboo.
For this purpose, we all agree that one of the scientific facts that must not only be spoken but also be taught is evolution. The reason is unfortunately obvious, let alone to support evolution. Whenever anyone tries to talk about evolution, even just mention it, they raise a huge hue and cry. These negative reactions trouble us and we want to change that. We have created our Lectures on Evolution themed event series to serve this purpose. We understand that our participants want to be a part of this change for the very reason they are participating in these lectures. During the Lectures on Evolution, scientists and researchers will give us an instructive presentation about their field of study. Then there will be a question and answer session where we will reinforce what we have learned by asking our questions. James Brooks is with us today.
Let us introduce James Brooks to you. James Brooks is a graduate student at Kyoto University, studying with Shinya Yamamoto, after doing his undergraduate at Duke University with Brian Hare. For the past several years, he has been studying primates and canids in the field, and captivity with the focus on the evolutionary relationship between cooperation, outgrowth competition, and the domestication hypothesis. His research focuses on bonobos, chimpanzees, dogs, and recently horses through a combination of observational and experimental approaches. In this talk, he will briefly go over the methods applied in the study of behavior and cognition, and then expand on how he has used this in his own research, focusing especially in primatology.
I must make a small reminder for our participants. If you have any questions during the presentation, just write them to chat, and if you have any difficulty in English, just let us know, we can slow down. When the presentation is over, our team will ask your questions on your behalf. Now we can begin. Welcome again, Mr. Brooks. We are very happy to have you, and we are already excited about everything you will share.
All right, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to my talk. Briefly, like they said, go over some of the methods used in this field, because I think it's not as familiar to many of you, and then go on more in detail about my own research. So my background, as I just went over, I did my undergraduate in America. I'm originally Canadian. I studied evolutionary anthropology and then came to Kyoto University. And I've studied a variety of animals, monkeys, great apes, and dogs, wolves, horses, in many different settings, with a general focus on cognitive evolution. So in this field, the biggest question is how cognition evolves. A lot of people study psychology, study cognition, and try to understand how we think, but there's much less who want to study how it evolves. And ultimately, a lot of our cognitive abilities, how we think, is an evolutionary adaptation. So with this field, the goal is to understand the general ways that this evolves. And for me, what's most interesting is cooperation, competition, and social cognition more generally. So as I said, to go over some brief methodology, the biggest staple in the field is comparative. So comparing different species, different environments, different social structures to see what consistently co-varies, what environments shape the same types of psychology, and what's more due to evolutionary closeness compared to convergent, similar evolution. Then probably the most popular and the catchiest is by observing animals. And with that, people have different methods there. Some of them study focal animals, studying one animal and everything it does, compared to those who study the whole group at a time and try to record the group as a unit. And those will be able to answer different kinds of questions. And also whether they observe at a particular moment, like every 2 minutes or so, compared to continuous, where they observe every instance of a fight or something like that. So these are the general methods of observation, typically using a sheet like the one I included, or nowadays, a lot of it is digital with digital apps and devices. And then also recently has become very popular is hormone collection and new technologies, especially with primates who live in trees. They can get urine or feces from the leaves or the ground and do hormonal analyses. And so then they can look at comparisons between individuals and also between species about the hormonal basis of different behaviors and how those change during evolution. And then with technologies, GPS and camera traps are now super popular to look at the ranging patterns, different groups relation, and how they use the environment. And then finally, the more classic studies are with ecology. So they can count what species are there. They can see how much different trees are fruiting depending on the season. And a lot of that is about correlations with other behaviors with different species, what shapes their way of problem solving. That's how it's typically done in the field. And then that will complement captive work. And for this, again, the comparative approach is really the staple of the field to see what evolved similarly and differently and what seems to be responsible for those similarities. One that I've used a lot recently is eye tracking, which is a new technology. You can see a bonobo is drinking some juice and watching a screen with an eye tracker. And so then we can see both where it looks first and how much time it spends looking at different things as a way of understanding kind of what they prioritize, what kind of information they are seeking. And that's really useful because it's sensitive for different species. Then another one that I've used a fair amount that I'll talk about in my own research later is playback design. So that's using a speaker to play back auditory stimuli, either of the same species, and you can look at, for example, food calls, outgroup sounds, vocalizations that have certain meanings compared to, in different species compared to control, and also non-social things like predator responses, like music, like a lot of different ways of seeing how they respond to an auditory stimulus they might experience in the wild. Again, hormones are recently very popular. Administration is something you can do in captivity, especially with oxytocin. You can raise their levels of oxytocin and see between species and within species, how does oxytocin affect their cognition? And that's a really central thing of the brain evolution of how these changes are able to happen over the course of evolution. And then finally, I'm saying it last, but it's probably the most common and well-known, well-used method is cooperation and cognition tasks with food reward. So for example, in the picture, following pointing or cooperative rope pulling, you can test memory of where the food was hidden. And these kinds of food-based tasks are used really effectively to compare how a species will solve problems and what they are capable of remembering putting together with competition, with cooperation, all kinds of things. And I'll talk some more about those in Bonobos and Chimps a bit later. But that's the general methodology in both the field and captivity. And of course, the combinations of those are really central to understanding a species' own cognition and the environments that shape it. Now I'll go into some of my own research. In my undergraduate with Brian Hare, it was self-domestication, which I'll give some brief background. I'll try not to spend too much time on it, but it's a very general hypothesis that seeks to explain why it is that so many domestic species have traits in common. So they have curled tails, they have variation in eye color, they have white chest patches, white tail tips, different jaw lines, the same types of coloration. And so people were really wondering, why is it that these have in common? It doesn't seem like something that humans would select for these random traits. So they predicted that simple selection just on tameness, on how they react to stimuli, that they'll be more calm and less aggressive. can actually have wide-ranging consequences through acting on the hormones, acting on development. And the really amazing evidence from this comes from what's called the Russian farm fox experiment, where I haven't right. They actually took foxes and selected them over many years, many generations, solely on temperament, on how they responded to a human putting their hand in the cage. And that was the only selection pressure. They made no other determinations. And then they found that all of these domesticated traits, or at least many of them, emerged in the foxes. And so that really got people thinking that a lot of it doesn't seem to be an adaptation. It's not like, oh, the white tail tip was for this, the eye color was for this. It was a general effect of selection on tameness that has happened in domesticated species and has also now been applied to human evolution, which is a really interesting area of current investigation. That many of the changes seen in domesticated animals actually match with changes seen over the course of human evolution when humans are compared to closest relatives in fossils about the shape of the skull, about the kinds of behavior. So that led to what was called the self-domestication hypothesis. And that's that humans, through their evolution, domesticated themselves, that it wasn't, that domestication doesn't have to be artificial, but can be natural selection, that those who were more tame succeeded, and this led to a process that looks exactly like domestication. And that also led to hypotheses that dog evolution started not by humans taking some wild wolves and trying to tame them, just randomly having this innovation to do that, but that wolves were able to get garbage. They were able to get bones and leftovers from human settlements. And the ones who were calmer, the ones that wouldn't attack humans, the ones that would be able to just be more relaxed and grab those, had much higher success. And they kind of started their own domestication. And then this was also applied to bonobos, who again, like chimpanzees, have a whole range of behavioral, morphological, physiological differences that parallel those of domestication. So this is where the self-domestication hypothesis was brought up, that it can act through natural selection. But the key piece of evidence that was missing is, if this is so broad, this can happen just with selection on tameness, then we shouldn't expect it to be super rare. It should be pretty common, and we should only have to see already domesticated ones or human selected ones, but animals that are currently experiencing selection that resembles self-domestication. So we wanted to find a species that was in an environment similar to what is predicted for early dogs and test a prediction of self-domestication. So we chose coyotes for that because they are closely related to dogs and very recently expanded across the entire United States and Canada. You can see in North Carolina on the East Coast, which is where I was, only in the last 50 years. And at the same time as they colonized natural spaces like forests and woodlands, they started colonizing cities and human settlements and areas that in many ways look like what is predicted for dog domestication. So we thought they arrived at the same time, it was the same initial population, they might experience selection similar to that of early dogs. So for this, we used camera trapping methods, and we had camera traps all across the state of North Carolina in a whole range of environments. And then what we did was look at that as a kind of novel object task. So we saw how they would respond to the camera, whether it was seen as a frightening, scary new object, or whether they were kind of chill about it and were curious, more like a dog, of approaching the camera. And then we also looked for traits of domestication. So like curly tails, short tails, eye color, and things like that. And so that was the general methodology. And what we found was actually it was consistent with our predictions. So coyotes in more urbanized areas were more likely to approach the camera. So that suggests there is something similar going on, that there's different selection pressures acting on coyotes in really wild environments compared to those with more human presence. And we also interestingly found some traits of domestication. For example, in A, that's a coyote with blue eyes. They typically have brown eyes, and only in humans and domesticated animals do you see variation in eye color, that it's not consistent. And then a white tail tip, white chest patch. In D, you can't see clearly, but it's got white feet. E, just really weird coloration that you wouldn't be likely to see in coyotes typically, and then a short tail. So combined, this led us to say that yes, coyotes seem like a really viable candidate for self-domestication research. It really seems like they might be experiencing selection for tameness in urban areas, and they might be in the process currently of self-domestication. So we can study these animals as a really strong test of the predictions made about early dogs and about humans, about what domestication means for human evolution and for other animals. And so that was the main takeaway of that study. I wish I was able to do more with it, but I hope someone can continue that research and look for more signs of self-domestication, because it seems like coyotes, there's something really interesting going on. So then in my current research, I'll go over some of the projects I've been working on recently, which is the study of what I call group-mindedness. So what I mean by that is in-group cohesion as well as out-group aggression, the sense that in a group setting, people will become almost like a unit as a group together, but also more opposed to the out-group. That in-group and out-group psychology seems pretty pervasive and seems like an evolutionary adaptation. So to measure that, I'm working on building a task for group cooperation, as well as measuring with observational measures, group cohesion and synchrony. The hypothesis about how this phenomenon evolved, this in-group and out-group psychology, is threat and competition in the environment of evolution. So looking for out-group stimuli, both auditory and visual, as well as the presence of actual competition. And then I'll talk more about oxytocin, but it seems really promising as the central hormonal mechanism by which group-mindedness evolves. So to give a general background, in humans, it's a really strongly noticed effect that out-group threat drives in-group cohesion. When people feel like their group is threatened by outsiders, when people feel like they are at risk of attack, they'll be much more cooperative together. They'll be much better at being tolerant of one another and working together. But people don't really know, people haven't studied how this evolved, whether this is just a weird human thing or whether this is more widespread, whether it depends on threat in the environment of evolution. And there's only been a couple tests with primates and with really unclear contradictory results sometimes. So people have hypothesized that group cooperation and out-group aggression might be evolutionarily linked. What allows us to cooperate on large scales might be the same as what drives us to commit atrocities and kill each other. And oxytocin has been highlighted because it's related to bonding and affiliation in all mammals. Basically, it's related to the maternal bond and many affiliation behaviors, but also promotes ethnocentrism, promotes out-group aggression, is related to a lot of in-group, out-group behaviors. So it seems like it might be the hormone by which this evolves. To briefly talk about bonobos and chimps, you might have heard some of this already last week, but they're humans' two closest relatives, equally closely related to us. I mentioned earlier, bonobos are said to possibly be self-domesticated. And they've diverged only recently, but they differ in a ton of really important social behaviors. Most notably is that chimpanzees will kill other groups all the time, that they are very aggressive towards the outgroup. They'll go on what's called border patrols, where they kind of team up as a unit and go around the edges of their territory, kind of looking to attack other groups, be defensive. whereas bonobos have never been observed to kill another bonobo in captivity or in the wild. They're remarkably tolerant of one another. At the same time, chimps do cooperative hunting, this really large-scale, complex, coordinated, cooperative behavior that bonobos don't seem to do. And there's a whole list of things, as you can see, that they really differ in a lot of central ways of kind of some of the things that we highlight as human typical traits. So they're a really powerful test of, well, what evolved and why, because they're so similar but so different. And then I also included some gaze patterns where bonobos just look a ton at the eyes and chimps look more towards mouth. And the reason I include that is I'll talk about my research on eye tracking. But regarding the previous research about cooperation in particular, in general, people see bonobos as cooperative and chimpanzees as competitive, but that's kind of being challenged now, where in captivity, most of these experiments have only two individuals, so they're dyadic, and they're kind of low pressure, kind of more calmer, cooperative settings, like a rope pulling task. There's no competition, it's just two. Whereas in the wild, the forms of cooperation in chimps are usually the size of a full group. They're usually risky and they're often aggressive. In border patrols and road crossings, I include an image. When they cross the road, it's really interesting. Chimpanzees, the dominant males will go and kind of keep watch over the whole group as they pass and kind of act as crossing guards to help them make it across. Whereas bonobos, it's kind of every man for themselves. They'll just run across one at a time and hope they won't get hit by a car. So it suggests that there's something really different, and it might not be that bonobos are more cooperative, but they have a different kind of cooperation. And captive experiments haven't really explored this possibility yet. Regarding oxytocin, it's also very little studied in great apes, but what has been shown is really interesting, that it relates to species typical behavior. So border patrols in chimpanzees increases levels of oxytocin in urine. That was from hormonal studies. And in bonobos, what's called GG rubbing, which is non-copulatory sexual behavior, only seen in bonobos that boosts affiliation between females. It also increases oxytocin. So that suggests it might be related to the differences. And they also differ in neural and genetic structures related to oxytocin. So these pieces of evidence made people think that there's really something about oxytocin and the difference between them. But there haven't been any comparative studies to test the direct effect of oxytocin on bonobos and chimpanzees. So that's what we aimed to do, is give oxytocin to both bonobos and chimps, and then do an eye tracking study to see how it affects their gaze behavior, because that's related to oxytocin and differs already between bonobos and chimpanzees. So to do that, we designed this box basically to give oxytocin to bonobos. That's a nebulizer device, and it creates a mist of oxytocin. So when they drink the juice, there's kind of just a cloud of oxytocin, which they breathe in, and then will get into their central nervous system. And so we can see the effect of oxytocin. This type of thing has been done a lot with dogs and with humans, even humans, adults, infants, mental illness, all kinds of things in humans and dogs and some monkeys, but never with bonobos and chimpanzees. So we wanted to see how it would affect gaze patterns. Then I have the details, but that's not as important. And basically we found that oxytocin affects their gaze differently. What's really interesting is that already their gaze patterns are different. Bonobos look at the eyes more, but oxytocin made that difference even bigger. Bonobos looked even more to the eyes, where chimps looked even more to the mouth. So it acted completely opposite, even though they're so closely related. And that really suggests to us that it is responsible for some of the species differences. I included some example images. You can see just the gist of it is that and made species typical tendencies stronger. And briefly, why we think this is important is because eye contact plays a really big role in initiating social behavior and choosing who to interact with and what you do with them. So oxytocin creates eye contact or eye avoidance, which will then create species typical behaviors. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that releases more oxytocin. So this is what's called the biobehavioral feedback loop, where it seems that something simple like eye contact through oxytocin release can cause really large-scale behavioral changes and cause a loop, which causes the divergence of the behaviors. So this study really made us all the more interested in oxytocin as the evolutionary mechanism that differentiates bonobos and chimpanzees. Then another study I did was with a playback experiment where we wanted to see the response towards outgroup stimuli. In the wild, there's some studies that correlate presence of outgroup encounters with group size, but it was very correlational and didn't have a causal effect. And in captivity, previous playback designs have shown cortisol and vigilance increase, which is stress hormone and just keeping watch over others. So we wanted to know how it would affect in-group cohesion. That in humans, outgroup threat does cause in-group cohesion, but what about in chimpanzees? If it's evolutionarily conserved, if it's related to outgroup threat, then we would predict that more expectation of intergroup encounters will change the social behavior with the in-group. So we had a playback design, we had outgroup calls compared to crow sounds as the control here. And we observed for 30 minutes and then gave them food, just a limited amount to induce feeding competition with the in-group. We had 5 groups of chimpanzees, some of them male, some female, and basically normal care conditions. So what we did was we had someone different observe each group with a data sheet like the one I showed. And at a whole group doing instantaneous scan sampling, every 2 minutes, we recorded what the chimps were doing. So whether they were resting, and if they were, whether they were sitting up or lying down, and then social grooming, which is the most common affiliate of social behavior, self-directed behavior, which is a sign of stress in chimpanzees, and moving, eating. And then we also recorded how close they were together. So for each pairing, each dyad, we measured in one of 4 categories, whether they were in contact with one another, within an arm's reach of each other, less than 3 meters of each other, or more than 3 meters from each other. And then in addition, we had kind of a 2-sided methodology. We also did all occurrence continuous sampling, where we recorded all aggression and play and calculations, but those didn't happen much, so we couldn't analyze it. And so with that, we had 2 hypotheses. The first, social cohesion. This is what I've been talking about, that because of an evolutionary linkage between these, we would expect chimpanzees to have greater in-group cohesion with one another after the out-group sounds, and that would be the case even when they're competing over food. Whereas on the other hand, the general stress hypothesis is that they would become stressed out, social relations would break down, they would not want to interact with each other because they're stressed out, hear competition, and that this would be even stronger with food competition, that it would negatively affect social relations. So this is how we tested these 2 competing hypotheses. And we found, first off, in the distance data and proximity, that indeed it was significantly different that chimpanzees were closer together after hearing out-group vocalizations. They became more cohesive in space. You can see the differences weren't enormous, but that they were significantly closer together in the out-group condition, with contact, arm's reach, and 3 meters being slightly higher, but less with the over 3 meter category. then with the behavioral measures, this is before the food came. Most of the results were consistent with the social cohesion hypothesis. Aggression wasn't significant before the food came, but they were more self-directed behavior. They were more sitting upright. They rested less. And these are kind of signs of vigilance and stress consistent with previous research. But they social groomed more. They were more likely to participate in affiliative social behaviors with one another following the outgroup sounds. And then after we gave them food, it was even stronger that when they hadn't heard the outgroup vocalizations, food made them really tense with one another. They weren't resting much. They were sitting upright. They were aggressive towards each other a lot more. They were competing over food, and they barely played with each other. They wanted to, they were stressed, basically, about food competition. Whereas when they'd heard outgroup sounds, they were more cohesive. They were more relaxed. They weren't aggressive towards each other almost at all over food, and they played a lot. So it seems like the stress from feeding competition was solved with aggression in the control condition. But when they'd heard outgroup vocalizations, instead they solved the stress with play. They kind of relieved tension by playing with one another. So basically that was really consistent with the social cohesion hypothesis. So it's pretty strong evidence that in chimpanzees, like with humans, outgroup threat is the proximate cause of in-group cohesion. And the stress didn't translate into aggression, even in really high stress feeding competition. So we share this with chimpanzees. We still don't know all about the evolutionary relation, but this is not a human unique trait. This is something that's shared with chimpanzees either through common ancestry or a similar environment. So that's why bonobos are the big question, is bonobos don't have intergroup threat, but they're equally closely related to us. So if bonobos show the same tendency, that really suggests it's an evolutionarily ancient effect, that it's shared between all of our closest relatives. Whereas if bonobos don't show this, that really implies it's about the recent lethal competition that in chimpanzees and humans, we compete with one another. We are competing over resources. We do large scale aggressive attacks, and that this drives this association. So we're currently trying to collaborate with the European zoos to get some data on this. I'm still working on a few other projects now, which I'll introduce, but I don't have results yet, is more about oxytocin. We want to see the effect we found, how that is affected by in-group and out-group gaze. So especially with bonobos, do they view in-group and out-group similarly? Or chimps, do they really differentiate between them? And does oxytocin make that difference stronger? So we presented an in-group and an out-group face at the same time. And so we can see where they look to more, and within each face, do they look to the eyes or mouth? So we're currently analyzing that data. And hopefully I'll be able to get some results soon. And then we're also giving oxytocin and observing with the same methods as the playback experiment, how does it change kind of more naturalistic behavior? So we're giving it to a full group at a time, and then I'm observing with a data sheet and seeing, does it change their behavior the same way as the playback experiment? Does it make them more affiliative? What will happen to their kind of natural behavior? Then we also are really working on measuring oxytocin following the playback, because this would validate that what we saw, the kind of in-group cohesion due to out-group threat, was caused by oxytocin release. That if we can measure higher levels of oxytocin, then we can really expect that oxytocin was the driving hormone behind it. As I said, playback with bonobos. And we also want to know whether the effect of the playback experiment will be stronger or weaker after we give them oxytocin. So that again will validate the differences between the species, and that oxytocin might be the way in which this tendency has evolved. Then I'm also, as I mentioned, I'm only briefly going to talk about this, but working on horse and dog studies. So chimpanzees and bonobos, as I mentioned, are evolutionarily closest to us, but what about the species socially closest to us? They've shared the same environment with us for a long time. We've selected them to have psychology more and more like humans. They're domesticated, like I mentioned. So where does the commonality come from? Are they going to behave more like humans because of the shared environment and the shared selection pressure? Or are chimpanzees and bonobos going to be important in these differences? So the methods we're doing here is we're attaching GPSs to free-ranging horses and dogs. As you can see in the top picture, that's a dog with a GPS, and then seeing the ranging patterns, different groups, how they form groups. And then we can give them oxytocin to see whether the ranging patterns become more cohesive or more aggressive, more calm in a domesticated species, and really importantly, in a predator compared to a prey animal, in a herd animal compared to a pack animal, because those are different forms of group, but both have some similarity to human evolution. The horse administration device, that's a picture from like last week. We just finished designing it. So hopefully we'll be able to do that experiment soon. And then also playback experiments we can do with domesticated animals. Some people have called oxytocin the herding hormone based on its role in human kind of cohesion and synchrony, but nobody's tested it with a herding animal. Nobody's given horses oxytocin before. So hopefully we'll be able to gain some insight about how oxytocin acts in common between domesticated species. And then finally, I'm working on building a group cooperation task, as I mentioned, trying to design kind of a tragedy of the commons type situation where they can work together, but if they don't cooperate, if someone else does, they all benefit, but whoever pulls gets the least reward, but the whole group benefits. So then we can test between bonobos and chimps, whether or not there's someone pretending to compete with them on the other side, and the effect of oxytocin, playback, perceived competition. And so this is a video. Hopefully you guys can see that. This is the device we're building. Now they're gonna reload it. This is one chimpanzee who was most interested at the beginning and started participating. There's only one rope now because we're trying to teach them how it works, but we put pieces of banana on each platform and then give the rope. And as you can see, this one is really light. It's not heavy yet because it's just training phase. But he pulls it in, and then both chimpanzees there get the reward. So we want to be able to do this with a whole group because, as I said, a lot of it's only been done with pairs of chimpanzees. There hasn't been competition. It hasn't been high risk. So we want to do it adding these new features to it and compare that to the previous, the other projects that I talked about. And that's basically it, I think. That's my research as I'm working on now, and I hope you have some questions. I hope that was understandable to everybody. And yeah, thank you for having me. I look forward to hearing your questions.
It was a very pleasant presentation that raised excellent questions. Our team has edited the question asked so far. You can still ask questions, so we will forward them if the time remains. So if Mr. Brooks and the questions team are ready, we can begin our question and answer session.
Okay, I think I'm beginning. First, I would like to say thanks for your presentation first. And there's a question about the domestication in foxes. You talked about the domestication of foxes, the Believ experiment.
Yes.
And in this experiment, we observed some physical changes on foxes too, besides the behavioral changes. Do we observe any physical changes in other species too, like chimpanzees, dogs, and
Yes.
or are there any experiments like this in other species?
Yeah, great question. So in the physical changes, we do see a lot of the same physical differences between, for example, dogs and wolves, between like guinea pigs and their wild counterparts, domesticated and wild mice. A lot of it related to brain shape. It becomes kind of rounder and more juvenilized, smaller and bigger varieties of them. And so that is shared with a lot of other species, and including bonobos. Bonobos, even in the physical bone structure, they look a lot like domesticated species compared to chimpanzees. Regarding your second question, there hasn't been really a replication of Valayev's experiments, largely because of just lack of time and resources. I think it was kind of a really unique situation that they've been breeding them for tens of generations now, over 50 years. So unfortunately, no one has replicated that with another species yet, but that would be really strong evidence for the hypothesis if someone was able to.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I will ask a question now. How does working with primates affect you in different aspects? How does it feel like? Can you explain briefly, since most of us are not familiar with such experience?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things you notice is how different their personalities are. A lot of the research, if you read it, it's kind of like, oh, chimpanzees, bonobos, monkeys, but individuals are completely different. And especially in a captive setting where you can work more directly with them, like through barriers, of course, but you have more interaction with them. Yeah, you really see how complex they are. I think like they're really clever in a lot of ways, and completely different between individuals. So I think the biggest thing is just you start seeing them as much, you see their cognitive life as a lot richer. You see that there's a lot going on with them, like with humans, that there's a lot going on. I think that's the biggest thing.
Thank you for the answer.
Hi, James. Thank you for your talk. It was really great. And so I have questions from myself, and I have a couple questions that have been sent to me. First of all, can you please stop sharing the screen so we can all see?
Yes, sorry. Okay.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I would like to ask, how long does the oxytocin last? And so how will you so how do you know if it's the natural behavior, or it's the oxytocin?
Yeah. Yeah, so for that, basically it will last, it starts at the literature in humans, which we approximate to be about similar for bonobos and chimpanzees, is that it starts acting around 30 minutes after we finish administration. And then from that point on, it will last about 2 hours. Usually we aim for around 40 minutes to 1 hour to be kind of at the most validated time period, but theoretically it should last for around 2 hours after it starts acting. And the way we differentiate is just control conditions. So we administer either oxytocin dissolved in saline or just saline, and then we compare in an experimental design between the two conditions. Does this increase or decrease in oxytocin compared to saline? So as you saw with the oxytocin experiment, the range of responses was huge. And some of them, even with oxytocin, they were less than others. But what we saw is that the change in each individual was consistent that the range in basic response and oxytocin was really wide, but that all individuals in oxytocin compared to saline changed in the same direction. So we can see not what kind of a basic amount of oxytocin will do, but that oxytocin compared to baseline will change the behavior consistently in a certain direction.
Okay, thank you. One other question is that, so you said you do playback experiments and then you give sound. So for example, when you do chimpanzee playback experiment, what kind of, do you give sound of a chimpanzee groups, or do you also try different species sounds that like predators?
Yeah, so far, all we've done is the playback experiment that I talked about with out-group sounds compared to crows as the control condition. Other people have done kind of chimpanzees, different types of calling. And this one, it was just kind of their general most common vocalization, pant hoots, compared to control. But we haven't looked at any non-social stimuli besides as a control. But that is an interesting future direction, is to see kind of other biological ones they might experience in the wild, like leopards for some species of chimpanzees, some subspecies of chimpanzees, or compared to completely novel stimuli, how they'll respond to that.
Yeah, that's
but we haven't done that yet.
Okay, and I have another question here I'll read. So they're asking, you did these studies on specialized places, like you, it's a control group. So, but isn't this, for example, doing experiment in vitro, because they will not have any interactions with outside, but they only have each other? How much would it change the conclusion of the observation?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And that's something we were thinking about a lot in writing the paper, is that these animals never have experience with outgroups, but theoretically we predict that they've experienced this evolutionary response towards outgroups, that it isn't something they've learned, but that it's an evolutionary response. So we might predict it be stronger in groups that have actual intergroup competition, because they might have learned that. People have made analogies between this type of experiment and, for example, with predator responses, where chimpanzees in captivity who have never had predators ever are terrified of snakes. And many captive animals, if you present predators stimuli, they'll still show the same predator response, because it's kind of an evolved, deep-rooted mechanism. So that's the perspective we had with this experiment, is that we predict that this isn't because that they actually predict that a group is coming necessarily, but that they have an innate response to group together and become more cohesive in the face of outgroup stimuli.
Thank you. And I have one last question on the chat box that is asked to me. Is so I have to say that I get this question each of my talks. So someone asked it to you as well, and that is from Planet of Apes. So I guess that's a very big movie in Turkey.
Yeah.
They're asking, do you believe, like someone is asking, whether do you believe it's the rise of the Planet of Apes is possible or not?
I mean, I think it would take many years of evolution to see that kind of large scale change. I think theoretically evolution could shape many species in many different ways, but yeah, if chimps are like the common ancestors and they experienced exactly the same selection pressures as humans for the next, it's been like 6 or 7 million years ago, then they might resemble humans pretty closely, but I think it would take a lot of evolutionary time before we start seeing anything like that.
Okay, that's all the questions from me. So we can continue with other ones if there are.
Okay, so I'm going on. And first, I would like to thank you very much for the speech. It was really inspiring, actually. And
thank you.
One of the participants asked a question. They say, I had read about the theory of wolves becoming companions of humans willingly after noticing humans' hunting abilities. and this resulted domestication of the wolves. Do you think something similar is possible for another species like coyotes in the future?
Yeah, I think, so the thing is, we don't really know exactly how wolves would have initially started that, because we don't have, behavior doesn't fossilize. We can't have fossils of behavior. We can just make our best guesses. But regardless, it does seem, the current evidence seems to suggest that wolves might have initially started doing it to themselves, whether it was an intentional thing or whether it was more passive and they were just hanging out around humans, and some of them succeeded better than others. But I think if the self-domestication hypothesis is correct, one of its predictions is that we should start seeing this around urban wildlife again, as urban wildlife colonizes cities in the same way that dogs colonized early human settlements. So coyotes being a perfect example, especially because of their evolutionary closeness to dogs. It might be a really prime test, and because they are colonizing cities incredibly quickly. Rates of coyotes, there's actually more coyotes in many cities than there are in the surrounding wilderness, because in cities, it's not human remains always, but they might find cat food, they might find dog food, garbage, but also like squirrels, rabbits, even deer. A lot of urban wildlife is prey animals, and there aren't really any natural predators in those areas. And so coyotes are filling that niche. So if the self-domestication hypothesis proves correct, I think, and over a long time, nowhere soon, but I think we might start seeing similar evolution happening in coyotes over the long term.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer.
Thank you.
I have another question. You talked about experiments with oxytocin, and I was wondering if artificial oxytocin has negative physiological effects on animals.
By artificial oxytocin, you mean like the stuff created in a lab, for example?
Yeah.
Basically, it doesn't seem like it will affect the animals differently, because it has some different properties, but if they are able to make it like structurally so it is oxytocin, then it should still affect the receptors, the oxytocin receptors, in similar ways. It might especially have different peripheral effects, but in terms of central effects, it's predicted that it should act more or less similarly. Yeah, because it'll still bind with the same receptors and trigger the same neural firing rates, is the standard prediction. If someone finds that's different, then a lot of research will have to be reconsidered. But that's the kind of going thought in this kind of research.
Thank you
for the question.
I have a question now. Firstly, thank you for this excellent presentation, Mr. Brooks. Our audiences wonder that what about the effect of habitat parameters on eurosocial animal group structures? Actually, it's a little bit general question to answer.
Yeah, so that's also something we really want to look at. That's something we were limited on with the playback experiment, is like I said, we had some all male groups and some single male, multi-female groups, but we really unfortunately didn't have any multi-male, multi-female groups, which is kind of more naturalistic. The reason that's not always as common in captivity is if it's all males, they can usually get along pretty well. If there's only one male, they usually can all get along pretty well. But when there's multiple females, some males tend to compete and be more aggressive in those situations. So that's something we really want to know, and hopefully we'll be able to expand the sample size to other groups at different times and see how housing system and sex differences affect this result. But at this time, we aren't really able to answer that. But I think it's a really important future question. It's not just sex ratios, but about feeding patterns, about the types of interaction they have, whether it's a stable group or they switch individuals more often. I think those kinds of housing parameters will be really important to understand in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you for your presentation. And one of our participants asked a very good question. Do chimps or bonobos use kind of simple conceptual metaphors in their communication or thinking?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, but it's one of those ones that at this point, we don't really have good methods to figure it out. It's always the challenge with this research is because we don't have direct access to the inner lives of apes. We can only judge them on the basis of their behavior, basically. So they do have gestural signaling. There's some evidence of kind of symbolic communication that there's some anecdotes, especially people saying they've seen chimps or bonobos do this or that. But as far as I know, there's not really good scientific empirical studies that's able to answer these questions, at least that I've seen. But it's something that hopefully in the future, when people come up with really clever methods or ways of answering them, that somebody might be able to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Firstly, thank you for amazing presentation. The question is, how do bonobos and chimpanzees talk to one another, and do they use sign language?
So there have been kind of more artificial experiments teaching ape sign language. I'm sure some of you have seen videos of that. Unfortunately, a lot of them, the people in charge kind of got really attached and they ended up going in not a scientific directions. So those are super controversial. And I think a lot of researchers are still trying to figure out what to do with those. In the wild, typically they're more likely to use gestures, though they vocalize a lot too. Vocalizations, yeah, there's a wide range of vocalizations that have different meanings, like food calls is one of the easiest to identify. Is they kind of do grunts when they find food to let others know they found food. They'll do gestures like waving their hand out to invite someone over or tapping someone to be like, oh, come with me. They do have a wide gestural repertoire, but that's another one that, and there's controversy to say the least, but they do communicate with each other in vocalizations and gestures, but the full extent of that, how much you can call it a language compared to just kind of responsive, almost innate communicative signals is an ongoing question of research. Some people are really strong about how to define language. Some of them want to be more flexible, but at any rate, they don't display the language capacities. They don't communicate nearly as much or as in depth as humans do. That is something that humans do that you don't really find outside of humans, is this full out rich language.
Thank you.
Thank you.
James, I have another question another participant asked, and it's kind of related to your answer. So they're saying that you do this as experiment in a controlled environment. Naturally, an emotional bond is formed between you and animals. Are there times when you question yourself ethically? Are you getting any reaction from the groups? And so maybe you can tell us about the ethical background of these studies and how you personally feel like working in these situations.
That's a really great question. I think really important to ask yourself and as ethical committees about doing this kind of research. One of the kind of principles for myself is I don't want to do research that there's evidence it will cause them any negative effects. Like with the playback experiment on oxytocin, these are thought to increase cohesion, more positive social relations. With oxytocin, it's very natural. They have oxytocin in them already, and it lasts only a short period with no known side effects in humans, infants, any species. So that's kind of one of the things is no long-term harm, and that it would be positive socially. It wouldn't cause distress. And then another important point, I think, for my research is the animals we study. So at Kumamoto Sanctuary, where I do most of my research, it's a sanctuary of largely retired biomedical chimpanzees. When Japan stopped doing biomedical research about chimpanzees, this sanctuary houses most of them. So it's also about kind of promoting more naturalistic social behaviors, like oxytocin and playback are both things they would experience in the wild, as outgroup sounds, increases in oxytocin following social behaviors. And with the horses I'm studying in dogs, it's also about social rehabilitation, where the horses, it's largely retired racehorses who are given a home here. And oxytocin, we're interested not just in this evolutionary perspective, but about how we can rehabilitate retired horses to work better with humans, be more calm and responsive to humans, because it's also shown some really positive anti-anxiety things, and also integrate new horses, new retired horses into the existing social group is how we can have these positive welfare effects. And with the dogs, managing ranging patterns of stray dogs is a big issue in Taiwan, but we're trying to find ways of balancing them that we can answer really important scientific questions at the same time as kind of helping with the wildlife management perspective. Same thing with the coyotes in North America, as urban coyotes are a big wildlife management debate right now. So with me personally, I think it's really important to kind of manage questions that are, you want to ask purely for the science, but also for the positive welfare and conservation, wildlife management sides of animal research.
James, can you tell a few words regarding like how do you position yourself in like as an emotionally, because like you spent your months in a close environment, like 2 months in a Kumamoto center with only chimpanzees. So how do you form like a relationship with them, and how does this affect you? Or
yeah, definitely. Yeah, like working with apes over a long period, you definitely start to have some bond form because they're really complex animals, and of course they start recognizing you. Like some of them are always a lot more excited to see me than other ones who I have a better relationship with. So yeah, it is a really important thing is you do start forming bonds. There's no question about it. So it's hard to answer what the takeaway would be, but undeniably it plays a part in the research. And I guess hopefully for other researchers, it also kind of validates and reinforces the welfare perspective about it. Like when you've got a bond with an animal, you don't want to put it through any research it doesn't want to willingly participate in. Even with like the dogs in Taiwan, many of them are really friendly. You can go up and just hang out with them like a dog. So you definitely start to feel connected to the animal. So it's always a balance between the research has to be robust research. You can't let just your emotional state influence how you take data or what you're claiming the research shows, but you should shape what the research is asking and how you're going to answer it towards something that will be positive for the animal and have some positive impact on them, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question.
Okay. There's another question from our audiences. Any thoughts on domestication of parrots, considering that they live in flocks and they mate with the same parrot throughout their life?
About parrots, sorry?
Parrots, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I actually really don't know much about them. A lot of recent research is really showing birds to be a lot more complex than many people ever imagined them to be. like parrots, I know there's some recent research about prosociality that's shown they're quite pro-social compared to many animals and really complex cognitive skills. Personally, I've mostly focused on mammals. My background in bird research is fairly limited, but I think that's really interesting is whether domestication acts the same in other classes of species is really important, because so far it's mostly been studied in mammals. A lot of all of the ones I mentioned earlier are mammal species that you see more commonality with. So whether this is applicable to wider clades like birds and how social structure beforehand influences that is really good to know. Like, yeah, because they do form pair bonds in many cases. So how that influences the kind of form of domestication is an interesting question that I'm really not qualified to answer, but interesting for future research, definitely.
Okay, thank you so much.
So there's another question, like a very interesting question from our one of our participants. They ask if, are there any experimental results showing that oxytocin changes primates' attitudes, starting to resemble the behavior of the opposite sex?
I don't think there's necessarily been any that have that kind of perspective in mind in detail, but there are signs that it, in some cases, like with some macaque species, it is more likely to flatten dominance hierarchy in males, whereas in females, sometimes it will promote threat staring. So there are a lot of sex differences between how oxytocin acts, and part of that is likely in pair bonding. If, like in most species that pair bond, many rodent species, oxytocin seems to be the force driving two individuals to kind of form these long-term stable bonds. So it is different between sexes. And that's another thing that we unfortunately didn't have data to answer in ours, is we didn't see any differences between the males and females, but it's a really important question is how does it act differently? I don't know of any research that's kind of the conclusion has been it kind of makes them more similar, but that's not to say there isn't any. But yeah, a lot of it also, they focus on one sex and they say, okay, we're doing this experiment with males, especially in the human research, or only females, because it kind of makes it an easier study. They don't have as many things to discuss. Yeah, but yeah, the general thing is it affects males and females differently in many cases.
Okay, thank you for the answer.
Thank you.
James, we still have a couple of more questions, and questions are still coming. So would it be okay if we continue for another 15 minutes or? Yeah,
no problem.
Okay, thank you. So let's say that let's take a couple more questions and we'll finish around 2 because it's getting late in Japan and James is currently in Japan. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have one question now. One of the participants said, I was wondering what could be the reason that bonobos and chimpanzees react differently to the oxytocin. Are there any projects researching this? And are there any correlation between evolutionary process and their reaction to different oxytocin levels?
Yeah, great question. So that's something we're currently trying to investigate. So what we kind of are taking away from the first study is that oxytocin made the difference bigger. It kind of enhanced existing biases. So it seems like oxytocin promotes what they're already doing, and that maybe oxytocin is responsible for how they're already looking to face stimuli. So with that, it seems like oxytocin is kind of, in some sense, doing the same thing, even though it has an opposite effect, in that it's making their existing biases even stronger. So that's something we're trying to investigate currently, and we want to look also at variation in baseline oxytocin in both species and inter-individual differences. Yeah, basically, our group is the only one really doing this oxytocin, chimpanzee, and bonobo research. So that's something we want to figure out, but almost certainly it's due to differences in their evolution. So the kind of one of the big ideas is it could be related to this outgroup threat, this intergroup competition difference, because that's one of the most notable differences in the environment of bonobos and chimpanzees, is that in many ways their environment, they tend to live in rainforests, sometimes savannas, but typically rainforests, eat similar diets, both have similar group structure, but chimpanzees have intergroup aggression and bonobos don't. So this could affect oxytocin's receptor pathways in the brain and could shape the evolution of the oxytocin system. That's kind of one of the big hypotheses about what could be driving this difference. And like I mentioned, the biobehavioral feedback loops, that another really important part of bonobo sociality is GG rubbing, which is what kind of brings females together, and the female bond is really central to bonobo social structure in contrast to chimpanzees. And so since that's correlated with oxytocin, and actually they make a ton of eye contact while they do that, there's some, it could be a hypothesis that it's related to these bonding pathways and the differences in forms of bonds. But that's something we need to investigate in the future, because there's a lot of stories you could tell about what's causing it. There's a lot of things you could point to and be like, oh, it must be this because it's related to these things. But we're going to need to do more experiments and collect more data to figure out what is really responsible for what we found, and hopefully new things we might find.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have another question. Oh, sorry.
You ask.
Okay. I have another question from our participants. And the question is, do communication ways differ in different groups of bonobos and chimpanzees?
Yeah, good question. So far, a lot of the research is showing that a lot of the gestures and communicative signals seem to be more conserved between groups, and even somewhat between species, like bonobos and chimpanzees. The types of gestures and vocalizations they do have a lot of similarity between them. There is evidence of group-specific forms, like how a chimpanzee group will pantoot, whether they have a rise and a descent, or whether it's more of like a spike, whether they drum with their hands while they do it. There is variation between groups, but it's still not really understood how much of that is based on just the environment they're in, how they're feeling, compared to it being a really group-specific thing. Most of the gestures seem to be shared, is kind of what a lot of research is suggesting now, though more is needed. But there are group differences, but they're not really well understood yet.
Thank you. One of the participants asked that I would personally expect both chimps and bonobos to look less to the eyes after the oxytocin treatment, since looking into the eyes is the cue of aggression for many primates, such as macaques. So I wonder, how will you comment on that, and what was your initial hypothesis?
Yeah, great question. So actually in chimpanzees and bonobos, it doesn't purely represent an aggression threat staring the way it does in macaques. And it's more like humans, where it can kind of take different forms, but it is related to kind of social closeness as well. Like making eye contact with someone can be a form of affiliation, and kind of tolerance. To be able to maintain eye contact requires some social tolerance and some social bond to tolerate it. So with chimps and bonobos, the role of eye contact takes different forms. And in bonobos, for example, the more eye contact when they GG rub between females is indicative of a closer bond. So that kind of validates that element. And bonobos, especially, like if you meet a bonobo they'll make a ton of eye contact. Compared to chimps, it's really noticeable even when you meet them. That bonobos will look into your eyes and it really isn't an aggressive thing. They're not freaked out at you. They'll be more likely, they'll be playing with you and making a lot of eye contact while they do. So it's not a purely aggressive thing in bonobos and chimps. Chimps, there's also it goes both ways. Like you don't necessarily want to make eye contact with like a dominant male, but at the same time, they will make eye contact before they approach each other for reconciliation after a fight. They'll look into each other's eyes like a test, like, is it okay if I approach? So it has a lot of different social roles, not only in aggression. It really influences the following behavior in many ways. And that's what led us to suggest it was related to this biobehavioral feedback loop, is they'll make eye contact before engaging in species typical behaviors. So it's a really diverse role, but our prediction was to answer that other part of the question. We had kind of two hypotheses. One was that it would enhance species typical looking patterns, and the other was that it would just increase eye contact, because actually in other species that have been studied, in humans, in dogs, and in 2 species of monkeys, if you give them oxytocin, they'll make more eye contact. So people have said, oh, oxytocin increases eye contact. That's just something it does because it does it in these other species. But what we found is it really depends on recent evolutionary history. Like people have been studying macaques with oxytocin's eye contact to say like, oh, it's probably the same thing as happening in humans. But in just 2 million years of evolutionary time, its effect has flipped in bonobos and chimps. So those were the 2 hypotheses we had, is the first being enhancing existing biases, and the second being just a general increase in eye contact. But what we found was strongly in favor of the first rather than the second.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more actually interesting question. One of our participants asked that a bunch of research indicated that the oxytocin level has an effect on suicidal attempts in humans, like lack of oxytocin hormone triggers the suicide in humans, for example. I'm wondering that when you enhance the oxytocin level in bonobos and chimpanzees, after the time that the effect of high-level oxytocin disappeared, did you observe such an attempt on animals maybe in a long-term period?
Yeah, we didn't really see any long-term effects. A lot of some human research is showing that kind of baseline levels of oxytocin, like if people have really low levels, then that can cause a range of mental health issues. It's a really popular research topic now in human psychology. It's being correlated with a lot of different things, and there's a ton of papers coming out that I have not kept up on in the human literature because it's so much. But it seems like in the administration programs where they've given it to like autistic children, for example, or many species of animal, they haven't seen any long-term effects or any effects after it wears off on them. It seems more like in cases where they've got baseline really low oxytocin or just low levels genetically or because of some environmental change, that can lead to a whole range of issues. But we haven't seen with the bonobos or seen much research indicating that in this kind of research we would see such issues in the long-term research.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if bonobos or chimps have social behavior abnormalities like autism or Williams syndrome.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question some people are talking about. For a while, some people were kind of talking about whether chimps by default might be more, like if they might have more similar gaze pattern to autistic people in general. Like they don't use a lot of the same social cues that bonobos, for example, might, or that humans, neurotypical humans do. And they avoid eye contact for the most part. Some of their gaze patterns are similar, But I think that's kind of an outdated viewpoint now. I mean, including what we found, like in autistic humans, oxytocin increases eye contact. So there hasn't been any cases of autism that people have concluded on. Again, it's one of those things people have told stories about. They've had chimps or bonobos that they're like, oh, this one's got some really weird behavior. Maybe it's a parallel to autism, but nothing really concrete that I know of, because a lot of research is still going into what exactly is causing autism, what exactly is the underlying basis of it. So there's not really confirmed cases of autism-like behavior, like syndromes in chimpanzees and bonobos. But it's something people talk about, and it's something people think is really interesting, is why then, if it's the case in chimpanzees and bonobos, what can we understand about autism in humans and how it functions? And if it's not, then what is it about human sociality that allows for the possibility of autism? But if it's not the case in other species, why is it, what happened in human evolution that made it so it's possible for humans to have autism? So it's a really interesting question. A lot of people are starting to ask, but at this point, I don't know of concrete research confirming one way or the other.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
There's another question about self-domestication.
Cool.
Are there morphological differences between aggressive versus non-aggressive nations, human nations, or human groups? Assuming we can categorize nations like this.
Not really, to be honest. Humans are still so recently, we're the same species ultimately, very recently. Like the morphological differences we see are really quite minimal compared to the shared ancestry we all have. There's not really morphological comparisons that have proven effective in identifying aggressive individuals or aggressive nations. And yeah, basically not really. There's more of a, and it's not like some nations that are more domesticated than others or anything like that. Like the humans, anatomically modern humans emerged around 100,000 years ago. Some people say even more recent than that, when the cultural emergence started happening, that we started seeing a lot of traces in the fossil records. So it's very short term that humans have, modern humans have begun to exist. So I don't think so. No, there's not really any tractable reasons to expect some human groups to be more aggressive, more domesticated on the other hand than others.
Okay, thank you.
So we still have a lot of questions, but I'll ask the last question. And before that, thank you very much, James, for your time and all the information. It's very inspiring, and hopefully we'll have you again in another time. So the last question is like, what's the effect of these studies on not only animals, like not only chimpanzees, but on human life? And what do they say about humans?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, for some of the domestication research and cooperation research, a lot of people kind of have the angle of, okay, what does this tell us about how to promote cooperation in humans and reduce aggression? How can we use these findings of these evolutionarily based dispositions to improve human beings' lives? And for my research, I mean, I'm still early enough, I can't draw any major conclusions at this point. But I hope my research in the long term can shed some light on group-minded behaviors. I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind that some of the things that seem positive, like cooperating on a group, really strong cohesion of a group, like pride in who a group is, can be correlated with some of those really problematic elements of human behavior, this outgroup aggression. And at the same time, it goes both ways, that this outgroup aggression is responsible a lot of the time for the kind of large-scale cooperation we see in humans. So I think a goal of my research over the long term in my career, although that's going to be a long time from now, is to try to understand what the evolution of these group-minded behaviors can say about how we should go about working as groups and cooperating between groups and within groups that will hopefully not encourage out-group directed aggression.
Thank you for all your questions and answers. The time we can use in Zoom is about to run out. Please forgive us for any questions we have not been able to ask. We have come to the end of our lecture. It was our second event on this theme. It was our first event that we organized entirely in English. We apologize to you if we have made mistakes.
First of all, we thank James Brooks again for the interesting presentation he prepared and his contribution to our lectures. We would like to thank to Science Club Executive Board members and all the Tree of Evolution Committee members who took part in the organization. And very special thanks to Aslan Niksarlı for conveying our enthusiasm to Mr. Brooks and for helping us a lot.
Thank you all very much for having me. It was really interesting questions from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and hope to see you again in another lecture. And we're looking forward to hear your further studies and hopefully collaborating with you soon.
Yeah, hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much and have a great weekend. And thank you all and hope to see you all in another meeting. Okay. Yes, bye.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And feel free to email me if you ever have other questions or want to talk more about this research. Yeah, feel free to get in contact.
Thank you very much.
I want to add something. Please feel free to give us feedback via our social media accounts, which can be found on our event poster. With the power of your feedbacks, we gain enthusiasm to organize such events. I hope we will see you all among us in our next events too. Remember Darwin's final sentiment, there's grandeur in this view of life. See you all.
Bye.
Bye.